Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia SQ-80-V tutorial. Today we're going to be dealing with the envelope section down here. Just before we do, if I can point you at the Patreon link in the description below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. This is what I do full time these days. There's also a join button by which you can become a YouTube channel member. Huge thanks to all the support I've received so far. Okay, what's an envelope? Well, an envelope is all about going on a journey from a beginning to a middle and then an end. During that journey, we're going to do something to the sound. This envelope that we're looking at the moment is going to describe something that happens to the volume of the sound. It's going to go up and then it's going to hold more or less static. And then once we let the key go, which is this very important white dot, we're going to descend back down to 0. So I'll do that. And here I'm holding my key down and then I let the key go and we descend to 0. So this is the envelope shape of the amplitude curve. And as you can see in envelope 4, it's hardwired or internally wired to the amplitude of the synthesizer. This is the volume. Now with that caveat said, there's nothing different between any of these envelopes. They all fundamentally do the same thing. It's just that envelope 4 is hardwired to the volume. So let's have a closer look at what's going on inside this envelope. Well, you can see we've got these 4 dots or nodes or points, whatever you want to call them. They simply describe a moment in time. When we press the key down, we're going to begin at this point on the envelope. It's going to take an amount of time to get here and then so on, and you can hear. So now that I've moved that second node down, you can hear the note get louder, quieter, louder, and then when I let go, finally quieter. And we can assign standard labels to these dots. The first line is always called the attack. This is from the moment we press the key, how long does it take us to get to our full attack level? Very often in synthesizers, the attack level is actually fixed at maximum, at basically fully on. That's not the case with this synthesizer. As you see, we've got full control over it. From this point onwards, we've got 2 decay phases. This is a decay phase. This is also a decay phase, really badly named because in this particular example, the sound's getting louder. So again, don't get hung up on the word decay. It just means a journey from one node to the next. Once we get to this white dot, which is called the sustain point, the envelope basically pauses. While you've got the key held down, nothing's going to happen. And then once you let the key go, we enter the very important release phase, which is from the sustain point. You now have no control over the synthesizer, you've let the key go, and we descend back down to 0. And as you'll see, I'm dragging up and down here with this node. The release point can't ever be anything other than 0, because the sound has to basically disappear at some point. So if you really wanted to, you could call this an attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, or an ADDSR. Pretty much nobody does, but you could. But the SQ-80's got quite a few powerful envelope features beyond that standard stuff. If I press full cycle, I'm going to press a note really briefly. So as you saw, the entire envelope got played. In other words, the full envelope was played. And that's going to happen regardless of how many keys I press. So, long after I'd let the keyboard go, every single one of those keys played to its ultimate end. If I made these decay phases much longer, that would become quite a cacophony. It's a very rude noise for what was quite a nice major 7 chord. Oh, we're still going. Let's pull these levels back down a little bit so that we can get something a bit more sensible. As you can see then, I kind of inadvertently dragged this node a bit lower than I really wanted to, but let's talk about that. The SQ-80 envelope is bipolar. In other words, we can have values less than 0. Now this doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're dealing with the amplitude envelope, because everything below 0 is going to be silence. So if I make these decay phases quite long, and we spend quite a long period of time, I'm just going to come out of full cycle so we don't get all of these notes playing forever. Everything basically below 0, below the horizontal line in the middle of the envelope, is going to be silence for an arbitrary period of time. Just need to get these lengths a little bit sensible so that they're not sat here forever. Silence. Still silence, and eventually once we go past 0, the sound's going to come back. So just be aware that that's behavior, it's a bipolar envelope. When you're dealing with other kinds of modulations, such as pitch, totally reasonable to have bipolar envelopes. In fact, it's a really powerful feature of the synthesizer. Many synths don't have bipolar envelopes, so this is a really nice feature. Just reshaped the envelope a little bit to give me a slightly longer attack and then a less interesting envelope. There you can see the length of time it's taking for the volume to get to maximum. And this allows me to demonstrate the V attack or velocity attack mode. Now when I'm demonstrating these scalar values, you'll see that very often I'll pick 0.7. It's a really good kind of average test case to use when you're trying out values. Very often if you crank these things up to 1, it's basically an all or nothing thing and you really don't get a flavour of what's going on with the control, but 0.7 is a very nice, just good average, kind of a tip if you like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press a key very quietly and you'll see the attack phase be quite slow. And now I'll hit it harder and it's more or less, pretty much instant. So this allows us to control how quickly we're going to get to the first node, the attack point, depending on how hard we hit the key. This K here stands for keyboard or key follow, and it allows us to control how quickly the decay phases of the envelope travel, depending on where on the keyboard we play our notes, low notes or high notes. Again, I'll give us somewhere in the 0.6-ish region, and I'll give us a decent decay phase. Now a low note, this is probably too long. Slow and still slow. High note, much faster. Just got rid of all of that stuff in order to demonstrate the next two values. Linear is referring to the velocity response, and we're not going to get anything out of this value unless we dial some velocity response in. So I'm going to give myself a velocity response of again around about 0.7. And now what this means is if I press a note very softly, it's going to be quieter than a loud note, pretty self-evident. Here's the quiet note, and here's the loud note. But that response is linear. In other words, depending on where on the keyboard I press, it's going to generate the same kind of internal control voltages, but the human ear is actually logarithmic. So if you want it to genuinely represent a difference in volume from low notes to high notes, and then loud, and now my highest note played very quietly. Very difficult to demonstrate, but basically it sounds like the same range wherever on the keyboard I press those two notes. That's because it's basically internally adjusting all of its levels in order to make it sound like that. Down below, these numbers simply represent the graphical interface. So if I change, just basically clicking one of these boxes, you can see as I drag up and down, I'm changing the values. The stage 4 release is a quirky thing of the SQ-80. It basically gives you a second fixed release cycle. So let's just concentrate on the release phase now. So you can see when I let the key go, it's basically traveling down that release line. If I engage release and do the same thing, you get a second line, and that second release phase is always the same speed. So now the first release is going to be really quick, the second release is going to take longer. Gets all the way down to 0 and then comes back and goes through a second release phase. It allows you to emulate kind of like a reverb effect, so that every time you press a key, you just get two separate release phases for every note played. Okay, that's the SQ-80 dealt with. Now the MSEG or multi-segment envelope is a much more complex beast. This is basically a common feature across many Arturia synths. They're implementing this window in lots of their classic synths. So we've left the original SQ-80 behind. We've got the faithful emulation if we want to do that, but now this is basically just extra bells and whistles if you really want to get fancy, because in an MSEG mode you can have up to 16 independent nodes. You've always only got one sustain phase, but you can have multiple release phases after the sustain node. If I right click on any of these dots, I delete them. So it's left click to create, right click to delete. You can also see that we've got these arrows. I can pick them up and we can basically have graded curves for very gentle transitions between nodes. Pick them up and it'll basically track along. If you've got a horizontal line, this is not doing anything because the to and from values are the same, so it's got no work to do. And each one of these points that I click, I can then manually edit in the window below. I've also got presets that I can select, which is pretty self-evident what they're doing. The MSEG envelope allows me to toggle between polar and bipolar. So the standard behavior with this button turned off is that it's going to be a unipolar envelope. In other words, 0 is at the bottom and everything is positive. If I turn it into bipolar mode, it's going to split the EQ in half. It's pretty obvious what we're going to get: positive values and negative values. Key time allows us to dial in how fast this envelope's going to play depending on where on the keyboard we press the note. So let's dial some of this in. Now I'm going to play a low note. Now I'll play a high note. The envelope travels much faster. Velocity lets us tie the output level of the envelope to our velocity level. So at the moment we've got no velocity sensitivity on this thing, so regardless of whether I press a soft note or a loud note, they're exactly the same. Now dial it in, and now we're sensitive to velocity. Soft note, loud note, not much louder, is it? Let's crank that up a bit. There we go. And the rate control is pretty self-explanatory. In Hertz mode, it's a fixed amount of time to get from one end of the envelope to another, but we can actually sync it to the host BPM, and we can also use triplet and dotted time if we want. So the MSEG is the most complex, the most versatile of the envelope types. And probably the simplest of the three is the DADSR. So this is delay, attack, decay, sustain, release. So that first D stands for something different from the second D, very confusing. So here's our delay. This is how long do we spend before the envelope does anything at all. So I'm going to press a key, and there's an arbitrary delay before you hear the sound. Again, very little value to be had when we're talking about volume, but for different envelopes, let's say you wanted to tie this to some modulation of your filter, and when you press the key, you just want to hear the unadulterated sound, and then you want to begin modulating the filter. This is where you'd have a delay setting. When we get on a little bit later in the series to look at preset deep dives, I'll be able to really stretch the legs of these envelopes. So I'm not giving you a million examples right now. We'll see lots of this stuff in the future. But it literally just is an amount of time before we do anything. And then we have the simplest possible decay, sustain, release mode. Now, remember earlier when I said the SQ-80 is unusual in that it can have an attack level of something other than maximum. That's not the case for your traditional ADSR envelope. This node here, I'm dragging it up and down and I can't get it off the ceiling. So the attack node in this mode is fixed at maximum. And that can be really nice and useful just to know that whenever you dial your envelope in, you're always going to get basically full modulation, full gate open every time you use the envelope, and then you can worry about what to do with your decay phase later. So I'll just give you one quick example of an envelope in real use. I'll pick the Lead Me Out preset. And here you can see envelopes are in orange. So anywhere on this preset that you see orange controls, that's the envelope having an effect. And indeed, if we have a look at the filter, here's one tied into envelope 1. So this envelope shape is having something to do with the filter. Now, if I press a key, a little bit difficult to pick out exactly what it's doing. It's because the envelope modulation amount is currently set quite low. So if I really crank that up, we're going to seriously emphasize what this envelope is doing. Now let's hear that note. And have a look in the filter envelope. You can see that as I press the nodes, this modulation amount, so the envelope is just a control value. It's just a value that's being pumped into another place in the synthesizer. In this case, the cutoff value of the filter, and that cutoff value is being ramped up according to this slope up to this point here. Got a DADSR envelope, so we know that this value is maximum, basically fully modulating as much as this arc is letting us. If I apply negative modulation, this is a good example of negative modulation. This is going to make the sound almost inaudibly dull because we're basically pulling all the frequencies away. Let's really hear that at maximum. There we go. So that's a positive envelope applying a negative modulation effect to a source somewhere else in the synthesizer, a bit headbending. Okay, that's it for envelopes. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.